Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you can see me. Microphone's hopefully close enough. Sing out on the chat line if you can't. I'll be doing this throughout the call because the chat line's over there on a different monitor. Welcome. It's office hours time again. And thank you much for giving up your time to come along and attend this office hours. We got a lot of things to cover tonight. There's obviously been some significant movement in the Oracle database world of things in the last few weeks that we'll cover tonight. Hint, it's 20+1. 21C has come out for on-premises. So we will talk about that and I'll explain why. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But also we'll try cover off the Q&A that comes in to me via various mechanisms, AskTom, etc. Hopefully because these things are aimed at answering your questions, not just floating around in new releases and the like. But we'll try cover both things. Let me share my screen and we'll get straight into it. Okay, hopefully, let me click in the right spot. Okay, hopefully you can see that. As always, getting in touch is easy. Got my little QR code if you need to scan that. Just saves me putting 1,000 links on the screen. Just go to linktree/Connor and you'll be able to get Instagram, Twitter, blog, Facebook, etc. Any kind of social media, including the podcast. If you're new to my office hours session, this is what I always put at the start of the slides. No need to adjust your set. The content is generally shifted down to the left. The reason for that is because then when we turn this into a YouTube video, I'll be at the top right and you get the, let's just say the best of both worlds or maybe the worst of both worlds. A few bits and pieces just to start things off for what's coming up. As always, I like plugging our live webinar series that's run here in Australia. That's run throughout the winter. It may be coming, it's getting close to an end, but there might be a few more out there. But if so, please check out them. We get speakers. There's a strong Apex and development focus, but there's a little bit there for almost everyone. This is our next thing that's coming up in Australia. In fact, it's the APAC region, which is the AUSUG Connect. And it'll be run virtually this year. So as I look sternly at any of my friends in the APAC region, yes, India in particular, because lots of friends in India, please submit for that. It's a good chance to visit Australia, so to speak. You'll be doing talk to Australian audiences and without having to have all the hassles of flying enormous distances, which we generally tend to do. This is also coming up. I've just recently submitted for this, the Oracle Groundbreakers Tour throughout Europe. Unfortunately, funny enough, the list of cities it was included on was on the speaker submission site, but now that the call for papers has closed, I can't tell you the cities anymore. Hopefully someone will put it on their website shortly, but a whole stack of cities throughout Europe. Once again, a virtual tour. Hopefully I'll be speaking at that. One thing I will be speaking at is the East Coast Oracle Conference coming up in November. I'll be doing the keynote there. So hopefully if you're in that part of the States, you'll be able to attend that as well. I'll be attending virtually because you may have noticed in the news recently, Australia has gone from virtually COVID-free to the entire eastern side of the country is pretty much locked down now. I live on the west, so I'm still very lucky. The podcast is out. It's been out now for a few months, but I've got a new episode out there, just put out there a couple of weeks ago called Testing. Tried to divert away from DBA and development topics more in terms of our responsibilities in terms of making code work, but in particular some hints about the things that typically catch us out in the Oracle database, those kind of edge cases and the combination of features that often lead us to be just finding particular spots of functionality in the Oracle database that may have may have snuck through the internal testing that we do for all of our releases. Of course, this is the big news. 21C is now on premises available for Linux with the other platforms coming soon. That's the official blog post. I think it came out on Friday the 13th. Unlucky for some, but hopefully lucky for many others. And we'll talk more a bit about 21C in a second, but just as I always say, if these office hour sessions don't cater directly to topics of interest to you, you have particular topics that are relevant to your particular business. If you want me, we can do an office hour session privately for your company. Just reach out to me and we can discuss, get topics. If it's a topic that I don't have expertise in, we can find other PMs inside the Oracle organization that will be happy to talk to you. And of course, these things are free and they're not run by salespeople. My message I always do every month, please get vaccinated. We want our communities to be back in person. It's nice to see around the world some in-person events slowly starting to trickle back. That's obviously going to be really much mandated by our ability to get vaccinated and healthy as a community. Yeah, the entire eastern seaboard of Australia is currently locked down, so we've got some challenges ahead of us, but hopefully we can come out of that and we'll all be back together soon. This is what we're going to cover tonight. So you can see the top one there, 21C is here. That is not a Q&A. I'll explain why I've put that in there, even though it didn't come in as a question. And some of the other questions, time of day controls on DML, order by and cursor sharing, detecting the limit of long identifiers, where is the storing stored? I'll come to that when we talk about partitions, and index statuses with interval partitions. All of those except for time of day controls are actually hangovers from last month, so I'll do my best to get to them because otherwise I'm just being rude to the people that took their time to add a question in. First, 21C is here. Now, why, if no one asked me a question about 21C, am I talking about 21C? Well, this is what my week has been like. You get like sort of something on WhatsApp, on your office hour session, are you doing 21C features? Are you doing 21C features? They come in via Twitter, they come in via email, they come in via all sorts of things. Everyone's like, upgrade 21C, 21C. It's all 21C. Whenever a new release comes out, it's all about the buzz. So I felt compelled. These office hours things are meant to be driven by the demand of the community, and obviously the community has spoken, and they want to basically have talks about 21C. I want to put a caveat on all of that. Yes, as IT professionals, we love squeaky, clean, new, exciting things. Be aware that it is squeaky, new, clean, exciting, and an innovation release, which means for the vast majority of us, we want to be upgrading to 19C if we're not there already. It doesn't matter that 21C has come out. This is the diagram you want to be looking at, in particular, when we talk about the reality of business applications. Don't get me wrong, at home, I've got 11 running, 12 running, 19, 18, 21C running. As soon as it came out, I downloaded it and had it running on my machine. But I'm not running a business. The reality is in your commercial enterprises, things like upgrades take time, they take money, they take budget, they take planning, and therefore they are a cost to your business. They're essential because we get things like security patches, etc. But take a look at the graph. 21C is about letting customers get early access to brand new functionality. But the release that's going to have the longest issue of support, the longest support, therefore not forcing you to upgrade again, is 19C. The vast majority of customers should be moving to 19C. It's the same reason why some 21C features have snuck back into 19. I know I sound like a broken record because I've covered this in previous office hours, but please, now that 21C on premises is out, don't get sort of sucked into that thing of, hey, let's get 21C running everywhere, because in 2 years' time, you're going to be having to upgrade again. Of course, if there are particular features in 21C that are business critical to you, going to give you a competitive advantage, then yeah, by all means, explore it, use it, even put it in production because it is robust. It's just the fact that you are now committing to the fact that you're probably going to be upgrading again soon. The next big long-term support release will be 23. So 19 to 23 is the logical step for most people. The other platforms, it's just out for Linux, which is obviously our most dominant customer platform. The other platforms are coming soon. Don't quote me, but I think we're looking in the sort of the 4 to 8 week kind of time frame. That's the typical thing we see. So you get Windows, etc. As I said, because 21C is an innovation release, a release we expect a small subset of customers to adopt, you won't see 21C for more of the niche platforms, things like Solaris and AIX, because the vast majority of our customers on those platforms are going to 19C and they're going to stay there for a long time and then go to 23C, for which those platforms will be out. You may have seen some panic on Twitter, people saying, oh, yes, you've ditched AIX, you've ditched Solaris. That's not true, right? They will be supported in these long-term releases, big long-term support releases, because they're the releases that those customers on those platforms almost exclusively adopt. But one thing I am super excited about is it's not out yet, but I have seen it. I have a pre-release version. 21C will have an Express Edition release, a 100% free version of the Oracle database obviously with some limits, but Express Edition does some amazing things, and it'll have all the 21C functionality in there. It won't be shoehorned or limited. It's a fully blown version of the 21C database, Express Edition. We expect that to come out similar time frame as to other platforms coming out in the 4 to 8 week kind of time frame, Safe Harbor, etc., etc. But yeah, there will be a 21C XE. When that comes out, I might dedicate an office hours to that in terms of ways you'll be able to make that work in your development environment if you're running 19C as your long-term support release. Now, I don't want to turn this office hours into a complete let's talk about 21C thing, so I thought I'd do just a really, really quick sampler. We're going to go through this very, very quickly. A quick sampler of some of the things that I think are pretty cool in 21C that aren't the mega feature. So I'm calling it a degustation, like a little sampling of eats that we'd normally have at a restaurant. And these are some of the little things rather than the big things. Because what's the big thing in 21C? You know, my goodness, blockchain, 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 crypto, crypto, Bitcoin, etc., etc. There's huge amounts of information out there about that. And of course, that feature being in such demand has now been backported to 19 anyway. So I'm not going to talk about that. One sort of close related thing to blockchain that comes in 21C and also has now been backported to the latest RUs of 19 is an immutable table. I think this actually will be more popular or more readily embraced than blockchain tables because of this. Heaps of customers in security conscious environments are struggling with this, the concept of we can have all the security controls we have in place that control access to everything, except for the DBAs. Ultimately, there is some super user who has carte blanche access to the entire database. That's a problem if you're promising to things like auditors and the like that you have incredibly stringent controls. The way we generally solved that in the past is with a thing called Data Vault, which is, don't get me wrong, an absolutely robust, enormous product. It has very, very stringent, very, very precise, very flexible rules for controlling the access, auditing the access, etc. It's a complete solution. That for some customers is seen as overkill. All they wanted to do was have their existing database functionality, but stop DBAs. That's all they wanted to do. Can we stop the DBA, or can we give a guarantee to auditors that DBAs don't get the ability to silently modify data? Database Vault can do that, but it can do a whole lot of other things as well. And this is where I think immutable tables might become popular. The syntax is very similar to a blockchain table. You create an immutable table and you specify when you're allowed to delete from it, when you're allowed to drop it, etc. By the way, if you're playing with immutable or blockchain tables, just be aware. Don't set that no drop until 25 days or 100 days just for giggles, as I tweeted out recently, because the only way of circumventing that, if you've created a table that has a retention of, say, 6 years, is to drop the entire pluggable database. When we say tamper-proof, when we say immutable, we mean it. You will not be able to drop it even if you're sys. But assuming you've set some reasonable timeframes there, here's my table called no messing. I simply populated it with the scott.emp data. And as you can see, I can't update it. The only thing I can do with an immutable table is insert into it. The rows that go in there are locked and locked forever. And I ran that as the sys user. Doesn't matter. There is no DBA privilege or above sysdba, etc., that will let you touch the data in an immutable table with the exception of simply inserting into it. Obviously, you need to have some careful thought before you do that. You think, what if I do need to make some changes? It's not, this is a tamper-proof table. It's not like tamper-proof, but here's the secret backdoor. This is literally a table that you can't mess with. Other cool things coming in 21C, some plan tools. One of the things that we often do as developers is we run the explain plan command. We know it's not a guarantee, it's going to be the real execution command, but often it's a good sort of first step in terms of checking whether we're going to have some useful stuff. So I can do a couple of different explain plans here. I've explicitly put some hints in to get different plans, but typically we would look at, for example, two plans that might, or two statements that might give a similar plan or slightly different plan. But now in 21C, I have a nice facility called compare explains. If I've set the statement ID, or click back, if I've set the statement ID, I can literally set them, what have I got, P1 and P2. I can now pass them into the compare explain facility, which is new in 21C, and you get a nice report. We've had this before for comparing plans that are sitting there in Feedle or SQL plan. Now you can do it for stuff that's in your plan table as well. Similarly, we've got compare cursor. So rather than having to find the plan ID, you can just type in the SQL ID and also the compare explain that you just saw there. So a nice little touch here about string size and pluggables. Way back in, I think 12.2, 12.2, we introduced the concept of max string size, such that you can take a varchar 2 from 4,000 out to 32,000 or 32,767. What happens though if you've got a pluggable database that was built with a string size of 32,767, max string size equals extended, and you want to, for example, maybe clone that or plug that into somewhere which doesn't have max string size of extended? You know, can you downgrade, so to speak, from the max string size? Well, it's very, very hard to know if you're able to do that. We have this facility which is coming soon, or so N21C. Here's my max string size in this database. It's currently set to extended. I can do this new utility, DBMS max string size check, and the only parameter you're allowed to pass in at the moment is standard, which is, could this database be put into a database of string size standard? If I get no rows selected, I could. So even though this database has max string size of extended, no one's taken advantage of that yet. No varchar 2s are more than 4,000. If I create a table called big string with varchar 2 6,000, then that report returns me some data. It says, yep, in the McDonald's schema, there's a column called X in the big string table, and that's not going to be able to work. So you won't be able to port that database or that pluggable into a database that has max string size of standard. So just, I like these little touches that come in, obviously driven by customer demand, to sort of just complete the implementation of various functions like max string size. Friendlier analytic views. Analytic views are super cool, and I'm not going to spend time on this. There's some good examples on live SQL. And analytic views are really cool in the sense that you sort of define how your data is hierarchically stored in your warehouse, which dimensions relate to other dimensions, which relate to the fact tables, etc. You're sort of mapping all the various joins that would be done in order that people don't have to write those joins themselves. So in this query, I'm simply selecting from the sales analytic view and nominating some hierarchies. I want to get the hierarchy for time dimensions for a particular year and department dimensions. I can get year, month, quarter, etc. But I just wrote a single table against what looks like I just wrote a single query against what looks like a single view, sales analytic view. Under the covers, we morph that into all the queries you need, joining to the dimension tables, the hierarchy tables, and the fact tables to come up with the solution that you see there, just that nice little summary. Notice there's no aggregation there. I didn't have to do sum or max or min. It just does it all for you. Under the covers, obviously, a whole lot of stuff is going on with analytic views. And so, for example, that particular query, if I plug that into DBMS utility expand SQL text to see what the real query was when I threw that across the line to the database, it looks like this. In fact, it doesn't look like this. It looks like this. Enormous amounts of complexity. Now, there's a lot of long aliases there, but the reality is that's the kind of queries that we used to ask our business intelligence people to write or the BI tools to write that the database can now do for you. I find our BI people would much rather run a query like that. It's much more sort of analogous to the actual requirement they have. I want to get department totals by year against my sales analytic view. The problem is massive queries like that can obviously sometimes have performance issues. And that's one of the dangers of hiding complexity from people, is what looks like a trivial query to them is actually an enormously complicated piece of computation going on, and therefore they can get upset when these things don't run as fast as they would like them to. A new facility in 21C is this thing called AV Tune, which will look at usage, it'll look at the structure of things and come up with recommendations in terms of caching the results like a materialized view, etc., or automatically refreshing them. There's various facilities in AV Tune to make sure that when they run these what look like simple queries, they get the kind of response times that look like you would expect from a simple query. Gradual password rollover is a nice one as well. Here's an example of how we would do it. We create a profile called Let's Be Gentle. We're going to be gentle to our users. Create a user with a password called My Current Password. And he's got the profile, or she's got the profile of Let's Be Gentle. Therefore, I can connect with my current password. That's just stock standard Oracle, nothing there. However, I can log on as a sysdba or any kind of privileged user and change their password to the pesky auditor's new password, because the auditors are the kind of people that come and say, yes, you must rotate every single password every month, every 6 months, etc. With the rollover, I can now connect as the new password, as you'd expect, but I can also connect as the old password for the nominated period. I did a rollover period of 4 days, so I can have 4 days in which I can actually use both those passwords. You might be thinking, well, big deal. Like, what's the benefit of that? Why would I bother, with a rollover password? Surely I just tell the user, yep, I've reset your password, off you go. The real benefit I see is in the arena of application servers. Because what we generally do with application servers is we'll have credential style wallets stored for each application server, and we could have hundreds of these. And in that wallet, we have the username, password, and the TNS name that we'll be hooking into to connect to the right service. Therefore, in the configuration of all our app servers, we never have usernames and passwords. We just have connect/at service name. That's good because there's no passwords stored in configuration files. Obviously, though, when I change that password, well, if I change the password, that means every single wallet needs to be changed at the same time. Otherwise, I'm going to break my application servers. I can't do a nice rolling change. I've had this at customers in the past where, because auditors have said, even for things like app schema passwords or application user passwords like this, they're not allowed to be kept in place forever. They must be rotated. We literally had to do it as part of an outage because you're sort of stuck in that risk model of, if I go change the wallet while the application is still running, well, that means if the application crashes, it won't be able to reconnect. If I leave it till the application is down, then of course I can't do a roll through because half those application servers are using the old password, half are using the new password. You have problems. So you have to take a complete outage, which obviously sucks. So yeah, gradual password rollover I think is going to be really useful for those people that actually have application server passwords stored in wallets. And obviously if you have typical users accessing the database and their passwords will expire over time, then that same rollover is going to be useful as well. We have a nice safer version of Data Pump now. One of the cool things with Data Pump is you can unload data and in it goes to a flat file. But what's in that flat file? Well, it's just data, hence the term Data Pump. So you can see here, if I do an export of the Scott schema and it dumps out, department, etc. Well, there's nothing to stop me bringing up a hex editor and going and hunting around in the code. Now, changing strings is trivial. I've changed Martin here to Connor. I've become an employee in this table. With a little bit more care and patience, I could actually do things like change people's salaries and stuff. The moment data goes outside your database, it is obviously less secure than being inside your database. And the problem there is you just import your data back in and voila, employee Connor has now magically appeared from that hacked data pump file, even though it used to be Martin. And you'll never know. There's no warnings. There's no nothing. One of the nice things we've done in Data Pump now is this new thing called checksum equals yes. It will make your Data Pump a touch slower because at the end, we run a typical sort of checksum command on the Data Pump file. You could obviously do this manually with MD5 and stuff like that, but it's just nice to have it integrated with inside the product. When it comes to importing, I do verify checksum equals yes. And you can see now that I've hacked the file, it said, no, you've done something dodgy. Someone's messed with your data pump file and therefore you can't import it anymore. You might be thinking, well, hold on a second. Like, yes, I know someone's hacked it, but I still want to see what the contents are. That is an optional parameter. If you don't put it, you will be happily allowed to import that data pump file still. I would sort of have a standard operating process of you always specify this. And then if you get a failure, then you might choose to import it into a different database, different schema, etc., just to do a validation check on what's going on. But be aware that just because you put checksum yes on the export doesn't mean you will not be able to import it just because it fails the checksum. You get to choose. How are we going for time? There's some really cool stuff coming out. This is a bit of a banner headline feature, so I'll fly through this very, very quickly. In terms of database resident logic, i.e. MLE, the multilingual engine or part of the Graal VM. One of the cool things you'll be able to do is put non-PL SQL code into the database like we do with PL SQL code. things like JavaScript, Python, etc. Code that is close to the data is generally going to work better with data. So for example, here, I can literally, there's a little bit of wrapper around it, but what I've done is I've got a piece of JavaScript here, which is hello world, and there we go. It actually ran a piece of JavaScript code in the database and spat it out. Spitting out hello world is not the most profound thing, but it also lets you talk to the database. We put in some various extra bits of the code there, some, a Oracle, MLE.js Oracle DB required, so a JavaScript package, some SQL, and you can actually interact with the database as well, in this time from JavaScript, and print out the results of select star from the employee table. Even that, you're going, well, big deal. Like, why would I want to throw away 30 years of maturity in Pure SQL? And Pure SQL still, is the best language to interact with the database. It's so seamless. You just code the SQL straight in there. Why would you do this? Well, think about all the things that have happened in the world regarding JavaScript. There's a sort of a common phrase where you say, you never need to write anything in JavaScript nowadays because a library exists for it. Every possible function has been written. Here's an example. In JavaScript, there's a library out there called Validator, which lets you validate things like valid email addresses, valid URL syntax, etc. You could write that yourself in Pure SQL, but then you've got to make sure it's correct, you've got to test it, etc. Why not grab a library that's been used by a bazillion JavaScript programs already? Load that into your database, and there you go. You can now do select star from the emails table with your new function, is email valid, and that's actually running a JavaScript implementation. So you'll be able to have a much more extensible SQL language and Pure SQL language by taking advantage of JavaScript libraries that have been written and tested ad infinitum. For example, I need to validate whether something is valid YAML. I want to run bcrypt to get, for example, things like base64 and stuff. I want to get, UUIDs. There's a lot of facilities that might already exist in the database, or you might have to write them yourself in Pure SQL or C, etc., or Java. Why not just grab existing JavaScript libraries? This gives us a much more extensible version of the database, in my opinion. Classic example of that, I watched a demo from the Apex team a few months back where they were generating QR codes out of the database. Could you do it in Pure SQL? Yeah, but I don't think I really want to be writing out JPEG or PNG formats with Pure SQL. Wouldn't be much fun. But yeah, they simply grabbed a JavaScript library that would take in a URL and spit out a QR code. Why would you want to do it in the database, not on a client application like Apex? Well, maybe you want to store that QR code so you can do things like spit it out in reports, spit it out in emails, spit it out in Apex, logic, etc. Once again, centralizing data in the database can be very, very useful for a multitude of purposes. And one of the things I think probably is going to be the biggest, most popular thing in 21C, and therefore will certainly be huge maybe in 23C when it becomes long-term support, is JSON is just across the board easier in 21C. It's just much more seamlessly part of the SQL engine. So I can create a table. We got a new data type called JSON, but you can just stick strings in there. It'll just automatically do the mapping for you. So there's a name of Connor. I spelt my name wrong deliberately. I live in Perth. Funnily enough, if you're in SQL plus 19 like I was, you'll get undefined for the JSON data type. SQL plus 21 obviously understands what this data type is, but in SQL plus 19 it goes, you have this new data type called JSON. Don't know what that is. But all the normal JSON value stuff works, but also straight out of the box, you can use the dot notation. Don't have to have the check constraints of is JSON and stuff like that. I can do serialize to get nice pretty printing. So that's, came out in a nice sort of JSON hierarchical structure for me. All that stuff is integrated with Pure SQL as well. So those existing JSON data types in Pure SQL now accommodate the JSON data type in 21C just seamlessly. So I can, for example, I can use object has and object put to check elements inside the JSON structure. So in this case, I've put in an extra element of status added to this JSON on the fly coming out of Pure SQL. And you get this lovely syntax now for amending your JSON. So for example, here I'm doing a couple of sets which change the values. I've got things like rename, so I can actually rename the key element. So I've changed the element name to first name. I've fixed my typo in my name, that's CONNOR. Append, I can add new elements to the JSON, just all natively within SQL. Lots of really super cool stuff. Even if I got JSON arrays, which has always been a little bit of a bone of contention in the database, because what if I have an array of 1,000 elements? That's still just one row in a database. How do I index that effectively? We used to do full text search. Now we have a thing called a multi-value index in 21C. It's actually designed for JSON elements where you have multiple values inside one row, one JSON fragment. And I can do where JSON exists, looking for the zip code of 1234, and you can see it actually use that multi-value index now. So it's a new index structure explicitly designed for getting really fast performance in terms of JSON extraction, etc. Really quick on the chat. Is this backported to 19C? I'm not sure what this is. Sorry, I missed the chat. When was that? 9:30. I assume we're talking the JSON stuff. The JSON data type, I don't think so. I'll be very surprised if it comes to 19C. I think some of the JSON facilities there will probably come into our existing things where you have a TLOB, which have a check constraint of is JSON, but I don't think I'll be very surprised. Yeah, I don't have an official position on this, but I'll be surprised if the JSON data type, because it's a new binary internal type, will come to 19C. I'd be surprised, but I think most of the functionality will. The attention log, cool facility. This is my Oracle 21C instance I installed the other day. Literally, I've started it and run a few demos, and already my alert log is 300 kilobytes long, and that's generally a pain, because when you look at the alert log, it used to be, if you're a dinosaur like me back in Oracle 7, the only thing that went in the alert log was when you started the database and when things went wrong. Couldn't extend a data file, you're out of space, you've got a data corruption. That was it. The reality is the alert log has morphed over the years into being any kind of diagnostic information that's going to be useful for DBAs or for support. And I'm a fan of that. You know, I'm a huge fan of capturing more and more logging information, because when things go wrong, the more information, the better. The problem is digging around through here to find out when things are bad is hard. That's why we have this new thing called the attention log now. You can see it's much, much smaller on this database, which has only been up for a couple of days. The attention log is a JSON format, which is really our attempt to digest all that data in the alert log and come up with things that are much more critical for you to look at. Now, when I say critical, it's not just bad stuff, but we're trying to classify the information for you. You can see the first one there, it says, we've got some information here. It's an info. The urgency is info only. We're starting the database. It's an important milestone. The database is started. You want to know about that, especially if it's resulted from a crash, but it's just information. However, urgency of soon is, hey, you shouldn't be running 21C with 25 other databases on your laptop. That's a fair point. And that's why it's swapping heavily. I've got my little VMs very, very small on memory. But you can see it's a much more structured format, and we're trying to classify the information. That's going to be great for official and your homegrown tools, but in particular, it just helps sort out all that data in the alert log into something which is going to be much more digestible to you as a DBA if you need to take action in terms of a critical basis on your database. There's a lot more. The full implementation of SQL macros comes in 21C. We got table level in 19C, but we got scalars as well in 21C. Some new threading facilities in JDBC to make it faster. We've got zero time zone upgrade. I used to hate having to bounce my database just because Djibouti has a new time zone, or they've adopted daylight saving, etc. Now you can do it without taking the database down. JVM patches. No longer having to stop the database to apply a JVM gem patch if you got rack. Unified auditing becomes the default in 21C, and now when you apply unified auditing policies, they immediately take effect, even for existing sessions. So it's not like you have to wait for people to reconnect to pick up those new policies. You may have seen, if you've tried to install Oracle 21C already, it's a read-only Oracle home. So that's nice. We've separated we've broken the microphone. We've separated configuration files, SP file, TNS names, OR, etc., from the software itself. That's always been a sensible thing to do. People used to do it with symbolic links. Now it's part and parcel. We have this thing called a mandatory profile now. You can set a profile which is mandatory. So people can't say, oh, I don't like those minimum password requirements. I'm going to create my own profile and circumvent that. You can, at the CDB level, you can say everyone has at least this bare minimum level of profile restrictions. Pluggable data guard is here now. Data guard at a pluggable database level. Automatic in-memory. The database will make decisions as to what objects to put into the in-memory for you. Automatic partitioning. I've seen a demo of this. Some of these things are going to be engineered systems or cloud only, but auto partitioning is already available on our cloud, which is you've got a massive table, the database looks at the queries and it'll partition it for you. That's pretty cool. Automatic materialized views, dynamic CPU scaling for pluggable databases. You can say that pluggable database gets between 3 and 5 CPUs as opposed to having to set a particular limit. PL SQL has a whole stack of new iteration facility. I did this in a previous office hours. The looping constructs are now insane. PL SQL qualified expressions. Prepare for data guard. That's super cool. It's a data guard broker facility. You say, I want to prepare that database for data guard. And it does all the preliminary steps that you would normally have to do manually. Things like, set the archive DOS, log archive dest, turn on the file client and file server parameters. All that stuff is done just with the prepare step, etc., 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 etc. Fantastic stuff in 21C. There'll be much coming, but I don't want to blow more than half our time today. Do we have access to these logs in ATP? I don't think you have access to any logs in ATP. You might be able to get them from VDOL or Diag info, but I'm not sure whether you're allowed to query them because I'd have to check. Just to final reinforce before we move off 21C, remember, it's an innovation release. 19C is probably where you want to be moving to. Okay, quick drink. I'm 6 minutes overdue, but we'll do our best. I'll be most disappointed if the number of people on the call now evaporates to 0 because you got your 21C fix. Remember, innovation release. Don't whack the table, Connor. I can see the camera vibrating. Time of day controls. Here's the question that came in. We need to block DML between 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. This is the ultimate in business hours control. People are allowed to update the data during the day, but they're not allowed to touch it during the night. How do we control this? Now, the big question I have, of course, is why? It seems such a strange requirement to me to have. Why it would stop people being able to update data for a particular time of day? I don't want to push back and say that seems a very odd requirement, but it seems a strange thing. The object of a database is to make the data available to customers, not to restrict it from it. But let us proceed. Let's look at some of the options with our first demo of the night, and we'll see that this is actually a little bit trickier than it might sound. So let's start with a new share. I'm going to create a table called T. It's just a copy of scott.emp. This is probably my first thing that came into my mind. If I'm going to stop any DML, I'll just do it with a trigger. I've got a trigger called T blocker before insert, before update, before delete, and whatever you do, just raise application error and say no. Now, that seems a fairly obvious and trivial solution. But funny enough, the reason I say this is a bit trickier is you then have to go and make sure this actually works. You have to test this. You might think, well, that's easy. Insert, update, delete. No worries, let's try that. Delete, not allowed to do it. Fine, I can tick off that box. Try and update. Not allowed to do it. Fine, I can tick off that test. I can try and insert. I'm good. But there's more to DML than just that. What about merge? Thankfully, merge will still fire insert, update, or delete triggers. So I'm covered off there. But what about parallel DML? Because that takes table level locks. Does it bypass the trigger? No, it doesn't, thankfully. So we've covered off that test as well. What about direct mode insert? Thankfully, direct mode insert is converted to a conventional insert if triggers exist, and therefore we also fire the trigger. So far, so good. Everything's covered off there. We haven't been able to circumvent this issue. Let's turn off parallel DML. What about if it's a foreign key? What if my table T is actually a child table of a parent and that table has a delete cascade? Will the trigger catch that? We have to test that as well. So here's table T1 as a parent of T. I'll add a primary key on the job table and now add a constraint such that we have a list of distinct jobs as a parent, and my table T, which is a copy of scott.emp, has individual jobs which now relate back to the parent on delete cascade. What happens? Here's my list of distinct jobs. What if I delete one of these jobs? Will the delete cascade be blocked by the trigger? Yes, it will. So the trigger is looking good so far. I just wanted to put these because it reinforces there are so many things you need to test just to make sure what seems like an obvious solution is indeed a solution. Let's now try SQL Loader. Now I'm using SQL Loader Express mode here. If you've never seen that, just a quick segue. SQL Loader Express node, let's try that again. SQL Loader Express mode lets you simply run SQL Loader with a CSV or various common format files with no control file. It just looks at the table, finds the column definitions, looks at the flat file, tries to map them together, and comes up with a SQL Loader control file on the fly. So it's a nice way of loading the most common formats. So what's my password? Did I get that right? Yep. Now that doesn't look good, does it? If I do SQL Loader direct mode, look what happens. It happily loaded 14 rows. If I look at the rows that were in that flat file, you can see I took all the typical Scott.emp rows and added the leading digit 8 to the employee number. Normally all the employee rows have a leading digit of 7. So did they actually make it into the table? Yes, they did. So even though I had a trigger on there, SQL Loader direct mode bypasses that trigger. So most of the time, I'd argue a trigger is probably going to be a fine solution. But if you're doing SQL Loader, then you have this issue. What would be the most common time you would run large SQL Loader jobs? Probably during the evening, overnight. Therefore, you would bypass this restriction. Just to reinforce, there are so many avenues you need to check and test if you choose what seems to be simple solutions to simple problems. So let's drop the trigger. What are some other options we could explore? I could do alter table T read only. This came in, I think, in Oracle 11. You can set a table to being read only. Might be Oracle 12, but it's been around for a sufficient time. Once again, we do our test. Can we delete? Can we insert, update, merge, etc.? That's all fine. What about our SQL Loader? Let's give that a go again. And that's cool, right? We can't even do a direct load insert because the read only overrides that. So SQL Loader, we're now protected from as well. Let's make it read write again. Here is the issue when you start looking at things like a DDL style solution. What happens if I have an open transaction when 7 p.m. comes around and I want to stop this DML from occurring? I can simulate that in a single session using an autonomous transaction. So what I've got here is I'm going to set my table to read only in a separate session, a autonomous transaction, and the time I try to run it, I've got an uncommitted transaction. My application is running. So someone has a DML that is not yet committed. What happens at 7 p.m. if I try to alter table read only because that looks better than the trigger, then I get resource busy. So once again, even alter table read only has its own set of special conditions, which are now more complicated because if I have active DML at the boundary time, 7 p.m., I'm going to have a drama. Could I work around this? Well, what I could do is do something like set the DDL lock timeout to a particular amount of seconds. So now I'm going to wait for those DMLs to commit, hopefully within 5 seconds, and then try again. Now, in this case, because I'm doing it with an autonomous transaction, it'll wait 5 seconds, but I'm still going to get the error because I haven't committed that delete statement. And we get the same problem. Could you maybe combine this with other things? Yes, you could. I'm not going to run this because it would take too long to implement the plan and do a test, but you could create up a resource manager plan, which I've got an example here called stop blockers, you can see here. And what that'll do is if someone is a blocking session and they block someone for more than 10 seconds, that session would be terminated. So I could use this in conjunction with DDL lock timeout, in conjunction with alter table read only, to do something like at 7 p.m., set DDL lock timeout to say 60 seconds, set my resource manager plan to say 40 seconds. After 40 seconds, if that delete statement is blocking someone, it's going to get cancelled, and then my alter table read only is most likely to succeed. But what was a simple problem is now getting a relatively amount of complexity around the issue. So as I said, this is trickier than it sounds. And I would probably say for most people, the trigger is going to be an adequate solution, but you do need to be wary of SQL Loader direct mode because it will simply bypass it. And obviously things where we have things like the ability to take triggers and disable them, you need to now have much more finely tuned security to make sure that those facilities aren't available. If someone's running a PL SQL piece of code as the same owner as the table, then they would be able to add an execute immediate alter triggered enable or disable. So you need to be careful of that. One solution I didn't talk about here, which I've seen floating around, is this thing called table level locking. With the Oracle database, you can do alter table disable table lock or alter table T disable lock. What that says is you can still do row level locking, so you can still do insert, update, delete, but you cannot do DDL. You cannot add columns, drop columns, etc. Why would this be useful here? You could put your trigger in place and then do alter table disable lock, which means you would not be able to do any SQL loaded direct load. In that way, the trigger now works in all possible scenarios. That sounds like a really nice facility, but if you do alter table T disable lock, that's instantaneous. To re-enable locking, let's say you want to add a column, let's say you want to actually do a direct load, alter table T enable locking requires all active transactions in your pluggable database to be completed. Not just transactions on that table, any transaction. You cannot have an active transaction of any sort and change the locking status of a particular table. So that's a big deal because you may get stuck in the situation where you've turned off table locking and you can't turn it back on again, and therefore you can't do the DDL you wanted to do. So that's why I didn't talk about that solution, because I think the risks there are too large. Ooh. Cursor sharing and order by. Here's the question that came in. If cursor sharing equals force, means we take every single literal and replace it with a bind variable. Well, this is someone, starting to worry that that's going to be a bit of a drama, isn't it? Because what if I do order by 1, 1's a literal, order by 2, 2's a literal. If I replace them with a bind variable, then I'm going to get the same piece of SQL text, but obviously these are fundamentally different SQL statements. Are we going to have some dramas here? Well, to clarify that particular position, what you should do is check the docs, because the docs covers this particular scenario explicitly. If you look in the docs, it says, if a statement uses an order by clause, the database does not perform literal replacement because it is not semantically correct to do so. So you'll be pleased to know the people inside the kernel team, they thought about this, and it says in the docs, we will not do that. At which point you think that's the end of this question, right? We're done. Part 2 is, don't check the docs. And let's see why you shouldn't check the docs on this particular circumstance. I'm going to set cursor sharing equals force. Therefore, all literals will be replaced with bind variables. But as per the docs, order by statements will not. So we'll turn feedback on. We'll set the SQL ID so we know what the SQL ID is. If you haven't seen that, that's in SQL plus 18 and above. You can get the SQL ID for the statement just run. Let's do select star from Scott.emp where employee number greater than 0, order by 2, order buying the employee name. The SQL ID is 19M something something. Just remember it's 19M. We'll reference that later. Let's have a look at what cursor sharing has done. As per the docs, it will not touch the order by statement. If we have a look, it very much did touch the order by statement. It replaced all the literals with bind variables, including the one after the order by. So the docs are wrong. That's why I said in this particular circumstance, don't trust the docs. So what happens if we throw another SQL statement at it now with order by 1? It's identical, except it's not order by 2, it's order by 1, which is order by the employee number. 2 different SQL statements. If we go look at VSQL, the same SQL statement got replaced, literals got replaced. But one thing that gives us hope is that there are now 2 children, 2 separate cursors for this same parent SQL statement cursor. Why would we have 2 cursors in there? Even though we did replace the literal with a bind variable, the database was intelligent enough to know that this was not the same SQL statement. They can't simply be trusted to use the identical plans, etc. They are fundamentally different. If we go look up, if I scroll back a bit here, this is why we needed to remember that SQL statement, the 19M. If we go look at VSQL shared cursor, which is the view we use to work out why 2 children could not be treated as 1. If we scroll down, we'll see the one that gets set to Y, if I can find it, is this one. hash match failed. And that's the critical one. This is simply saying that we could not share these statements, even though the SQL text, once it had been bindized or turned into bind variables, even though that ended up with the exact SQL text, we could not share them due to hash match failed. Let's proceed. So what's hash match failed? If we go look in the docs at that, it says, no existing child cursors have unsafe literal bind hash values required by the current cursor. And the keyword there is unsafe. It would be unsafe to treat those two SQL statements as the same. A doc bug has been logged. So unfortunately, it's just probably bad semantics. The docs really were their intention was saying, yes, there is no way we're going to share that SQL statement. But the reality is we do actually go grab that literal in the order by and we do replace it with a bind variable. But we're smart enough to know that these are still two different cursors, even though they have the same SQL text now. So we're not going to get wrong results. You're not going to get bad execution plans, but the docs do need to be corrected. Long identifiers. Let's talk about long identifiers. In 12.2, we can have identifiers up to 128 bytes long, and before that it was limited to 30 bytes. I'm writing a code generator. Is there a way of working out what the limit is inside the database? And you might be thinking, well, this is trivial, because I would simply say, okay, if I'm on 12.2 and above, it's 128. If I'm on 12.1 and below, it's 30. It's actually not that easy because, for example, if I go to my database here, $V version 19.0, immediately it'd go, I'll be able to use 128 byte identifiers. I try create one with my really long, my really wonderful descriptive name, and I get identifier is too long. Why would this happen? Because compatible is not set to 19. And this is not uncommon. We typically upgrade our databases and leave compatible at the lower setting for an amount of time that we might need to go downgrading if the upgrade fails. And then after a certain amount of time, we say, yep, we're definitely staying on 19C from now on. The next outage, we would actually up the compatible. So it's common for the compatible to lag behind the release number. And so you can have these scenarios where it looks like you can have long identifiers, but in reality, you can't. Or maybe I just query $parameter. The problem is $parameter is a protected view. We don't let people see it normally. If you're going to go grant someone that facility, that's going to be tough if you're writing a code generator that's going to be run on other people's databases. It's generally not good practice to say, oh, by the way, we need access to very secure views in order for our application to run properly. That's not going to make you a lot of friends. What if I go look at DBA tab columns? Just go find what's the maximum length of one of the, for example, all tab columns view, because the owner table, the owner column, the table name column, etc. in the data dictionary itself goes out from 30 to 128. The problem with that is we made this change in Oracle 12.1, but we didn't allow it. We didn't activate it. So in 12.1, we increased the size of all the data dictionary items to 128, but you were still limited to 30. This was like a two-way step. First, we updated the dictionary to be 128, and then in 12.2, we let you take advantage of it. So even just looking at the data dictionary itself to see if there were some long identifiers doesn't matter. You still won't be able to do it until you're at 12.2, in which we actually took advantage of it. So in 12.1, you didn't get that facility. So these are my solutions, and they're not great. That's why I said others are welcome. If you come up with some better ideas, that'd be fantastic. These are my solutions of how you could detect it without actually, having to have privileged access. One is I can create a function inside a with statement. These are what we call user-defined functions. And I'm going to deliberately try to do something wrong. I'm going to say, okay, here's my identifier that is longer than 30 characters. If I get an error, return 1, otherwise return 0. And I can select that, are longs allowed? If I return 0, I can have long identifiers, otherwise I can't. I can shrink that down. In PL SQL, we have a pre-built function called aura max name length. This was actually designed for making portable code across the different versions of the Oracle database. And so we have the same facility here. What I can do is I can say case when aura max name length 128, then 0 else 1, select long allowed from Joule. But still, I'm running a little peel SQL function inside a SQL statement. That's probably the best I can come up with. So if you have better options, please let me know. Hit me up on Twitter, etc. But they're the best options I can come up with to give you a cast iron answer as to whether you can use a 30-character column name or a 128-character column name or variable name, etc., etc. And if you do have other solutions, the question is, what should the solution be? Should it be something inside, say, DBMS utility, which says what's the maximum length you can have? Should it be some SQL function? I'm throwing this out there to the forum. Send me a message on Twitter. I'm curious as to what you think the solution should be, and then I'll try have a bit of leverage and see if we can push this back into the Oracle database to have it released in, say, 23C. Store in. How are we going for time? 9:56. We might run a little bit over, but we'll try. I promised I'd get the Q&A parts done, so we'll try to do it. I can also see my poor dog desperate to get out, but he'll just have to hang on. Store in. I've created a partition table using the store in clause for the table spaces. The DDL shows this, but I can't find anywhere inside the data dictionary. Where is it stored? Let's do a demo to see what the store in facility is. It's rarely used with interval partitions, and then explain how we're going to find it inside the database. Should same SQL have the same hash? Yes. With cursor sharing as force, it's a little bit subtle. We have a thing called the, you'll see a thing called the cursor sharing force signature, but generally the hash for a SQL is taking the actual SQL text and actually putting it through a hash function. So it'll come up with the same hash value. You can actually get the hash value if inside DBMS utility, there's a thing called get SQL hash. So you can actually take your own SQL text and actually put it in there. We covered that actually in an office hours session a few months back. So check out my YouTube channel. There'll be a video on it there. Okay, back to store in and partitions. I've created my table called T, and this is the store in clause that you may not have seen. We typically use it for hash partitions, but you can use it with any partitioning system. You can see I've created a table. I'm partitioning by range, interval, nice and simple, but I've got this store in, and I nominate, in this case, 3 table spaces. These are 3 table spaces that just exist on this small database here. I've got my AskTom copy, one called large TS, and one called users. I'm going to load it up with some data there. So obviously in interval partitions, I could have 1 partition, 10 partition, I could have 100 partition. It varies. What does the database do when I say store in these 3 table spaces? There's 10,000 rows in there. This is what it does. It's simply round robinson. The first partition went into users, then went to AskTom, then to large TS, then back to users, etc. It simply round robins the table spaces. This is why I'm not entirely sure whether you would actually use this commonly nowadays, because this may have made sense back in the day when we would have very careful placement of data files on disks, etc. But nowadays we have giant disk farms, giant RAID stripes, etc. We don't really know what disks our data is stored on. So you may as well actually just have a single table space. If it gets too, if the data gets too big, just make it a big file table space. Seems odd to me to use the store in clause nowadays, but if you do it, that's what happens. We simply round robin through the list of available table spaces. If I drop that table and recreate it so that it's empty, how do I find out these 3 pieces of information? Because I only saw that before by loading up some data and seeing the round robining of table spaces. So this must be stored somewhere. Where is it? Here, the table only has 1 partition at the moment, so I can't find that out from user tab partitions. If I go query the table the catalog view we normally use for anything to do with partitioning, which is user part tables, DBA part tables, etc. If we scroll down, we can see there's all the bits and pieces of the default table space name, all the defaults, etc. But in this thing, there is no list of anywhere where those 3 table spaces are stored. It turns out it's stored in a thing called sys insert tsn list $. And you join that back to user objects and sysTS $, and you get the list of 3 table spaces. So if I found it deep down in the kernel, what I'm hoping for now is maybe that is referenced in some database view somewhere. So I go look at DBA dependencies for that, and it's referenced in this view. So let's look at DBA dependencies for that view, and there's nothing. So we can safely say that that information, the stored information, is not exposed to the data dictionary for typical usage. That I think is an omission because you should be able to get it. In fact, the only way you can get it officially in the supported way is to actually generate the DDL, and you can see it comes out in the DDL. So yeah, unfortunately, it is not exposed to us. That's a sad answer to the question. I've given you the hint there. You can go create your own little view on sys.insert_tsn list. Obviously, that's not supported, but it's in there if you need it. But actually, the only supported way at the moment is to actually go and get the DDL. Now, it's 10 o'clock. I think I've got one more question to do. So will we do it or not? Or will we leave it for next month? Unusual. This one takes a while, so I think we might skip this one. We're going to put this on till next month. So let's seamlessly jump to the end of the session. Stop the share. As always, thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed this session. I know it was a bit of a mix and match between our normal Q&A, which I think is what we're meant to be doing most of the time, and 21C. But as I said, the amount of messages I got saying, tell us about 21C. Remember, 19C, that's where the action is. But rest assured, I'll be doing some videos on 21C and some blog posts on 21C because people just demand it. And hopefully it's a way of inspiring you to explore the functionality that comes with the database, which is very cool. Thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Don't forget, you can catch up with me on Twitter, on my blog. Check out the podcast as well. There'll be a new episode of that coming out in the next week or so. As always, thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll see you in the next office hours. If you're a regular office hours, don't forget the Apex office hours, I think, starts now, and they're talk about universal theme. So if you're a developer, you definitely want to be hooking into that session. Jump on to AskTom to see the details. Other than that, bye for now, everyone. Thank you again, and we'll see you next month on office hours.